Hi, we're here to present our paper called COVID-19 Knowledge Graph, Accelerating Information Retrieval and Discovery for Scientific Literature. I am Kobe Wise. I'm a senior deep learning scientist at Amazon Web Services, and I'm joined by Miguel Romero Calvo, who's a data scientist as well at Amazon Web Services AI. So for our talk today, we're going to be presenting a number of things. First, we're going to give some motivation on the problem in the paper. Next, we'll actually be discussing a quick background, just introductory background on graphs. And then third, we'll kind of be stepping into how we construct the COVID-19 knowledge graph, how we create the graph and the infrastructure supporting it. Then we'll transition and discuss a couple of applied examples of how we can use a knowledge graph for information retrieval. And third, we'll be diving deep into an applied application using machine learning that essentially uses the graph to create an article recommendation system. And then finally, we'll be discussing evaluation analysis behind the methodologies presented. So on the motivation, I mean, the end goal here is that COVID-19 obviously is a relatively new disease. It's still expanding. There's many scientific articles that are being published daily on the disease. As we know, this literature is rapidly expanding. Traditionally, when we think about search among scientific literature, on the left here, we present Sinequa's COVID search. We know that generally speaking, scientific search engines generally present you a search bar to kind of search for what you're looking for. Interestingly, finding actionable information is still quite hard because this implies that you have an implicit prior knowledge or some understanding of what you're going to be looking for. And even in that scenario on the right here, where we're searching for something like IL-6 inhibitors, we see that these search systems still return thousands of results, in this case 8,600 results for IL-6 inhibitors, which makes it challenging, still quite intractable to find actionable insights from. So implicitly, there's a need for better information extraction, discovery, and visualization tools. So the goal of the COVID-19 knowledge graph is essentially to enable researchers to find insights and actual insights from over 200,000 scientific articles on COVID-19. Additionally, you want to be able to help researchers to visualize complex relationships that exist in the data, and to discover new related information. So implicitly what we're doing is we're taking hundreds of thousands of scientific articles in unstructured full text form and actually curating a knowledge graph from that information as you see on the right. So essentially following this process. So the summary of the contributions in the paper are we construct a scientific knowledge graph from these articles, and we actually enrich them with biomedical relationships using NLP technologies. Second, we demonstrate information retrieval is possible with this graph, and visualization discovery capabilities are implicitly possible as well. Third, we actually use this for a practical but novel ML application of creating a document retrieval recommendation system that actually combines the semantic information in the articles with the document topological information from the knowledge graph. Lastly, we make the COVID-19 knowledge graph, or CKG, publicly available on aws.amazon.com COVID-19 data lake. And we also make the knowledge graph available in a second format on core19.aws, which we'll talk about, but essentially is an open source search engine that leverages the knowledge graph plus natural language search capabilities to help researchers find exact information from these hundreds of thousands of scientific articles on COVID-19. So to quickly give some background on knowledge graphs. So implicitly, knowledge graphs capture relations between real-world entities. And what that really means is, and technically what we do here, is we generally think about relations defined as triplets, where you have a head entity, relation type, and a tail entity. So on the left here, you can kind of see that we have, let's say a paper node in red, and we at the bottom in blue, we have a biomedical topic that has been found within this article. So we can connect this or create this triplet where we have essentially a paper, a biomedical relation, and a topic, creating this triplet relation. Many of these triplet relations essentially create a graph. So you can think about a graph as actually implicitly trying to capture real-world relationships, and you can enrich it with, using other tools like we do, and we'll be discussing, in this case, NLP-based tools. So how do we actually construct and curate this knowledge graph? Specifically, what is the data model, what is the creation methodology, and how do we actually create the infrastructure to support it? So The CKG is actually a directed property graph with over 330,000 entities and 3.3 million relations. It is constructed from the COVID-19 open research dataset, which is made available from the Allen Institute for AI. The dataset is actually, as of this week, over 200,000 full-text articles. When we originally created and submitted the paper, it was only 60,000 articles. So as you can see, again, the scientific count of articles is expanding rapidly. It comes from multiple sources, such as PubMed and bioRxiv, and actually covers many disciplines: virology, translational medicine, computer science, etc. But what we're able to do with this data set and really the data model behind the CKG is that we have 5 main entity types, as you see on the right. We have papers, authors, institutions, concepts, etc. And that encompasses the over 330,000 entities. And we have 5 main relation types, which ultimately create 3.3 million relations in the graph. So turning over to graph creation, the graph creation process is comprised of 4 main steps. Step 1 is actually the entity relation extraction, where we actually extract entities such as authors, institutions, and their relations directly from the full text articles. The second step is actually the enrichment step, where we enrich this data with biomedical entity information. So specifically using Amazon Comprehend Medical named entity recognition service, we can extract biomedical concepts from the corpus of text. Next, we actually train a ZLDA model on a subset of the data. And then as new data comes in, we're actually able to use the learned topics vectors to extract topics. Importantly, we actually also use a classifier as a chaining methodology, which allows us to not have to retrain the model as new data comes in. Instead, as new data comes in, we extract topics according to the learned topic distributions, and we use a classifier to essentially merge topics that are from new documents into existing topic vectors. The third step is a linking step, where we then actually link the entity relations after normalization to form the graph. The fourth step is the graph is hosted on a fully managed Amazon Neptune graph database, and we use the Tinkerpop Gremlin query system to traverse this graph. And so how can we use this knowledge graph for information retrieval? How can we actually exploit this graph once we've built it? Well, we can actually use structured graph queries to extract complex information. So in this situation, let's say a scientific researcher says, what papers, or find me papers that are discussing specific risk factors, such as asthma, heart disease, etc., where that are most cited by authors. So implicitly, there's a ranking going on here as well. What we can do here is using a gremlin structured query, we can actually return papers. In this case, we can see the first paper, the molecular biology of coronavirus, has actually been cited 498 times. So this is a multi-hop search that's capturing both papers and their connections to biomedical concepts of interest, and then doing an explicit ranking based on citations within our data set, or using the citation network of our graph. Next, we can actually do visualization, which can help us find and discover new information. So here, if given a query, what are the authors and institutions publishing research on the drug remdesivir in human lab trials? We can actually see in the top left here, this green box is actually capturing a multi-institutional collaboration, where this paper has actually been published from 2 institutions in yellow. In the middle here, we can actually see an author research leader, quote unquote, which essentially is an author that has published multiple papers on remdesivir in human lab trials. And the bottom arrow, we can see institutional research leader, where essentially this institution has published multiple unique papers on this, based on this search query. All that is new and able to be, it comes exactly from the visualization capabilities of the graph. Lastly, and most interestingly, we can use this for a practical ML application to then basically recommend articles or similar articles based on user search histories. So in COVID-19, which we're showing here now, on the far right, we actually will show users recommendations or similar papers, the top 5 most similar papers based on the article they clicked on. And that's simply actually using the COVID-19 knowledge graph. And then we also see that there's other features that power this, such as our citation network, that are implicit multi-hop features that come out of it. Turning this over to Miguel, he's going to talk more about the recommendation engine. 5.
Thank you, Colby. Now I'm going to talk how we're using SciBird and Transy for the recommendation engine. So as you can see here in the left, we use SciBird at the sentence level, and then we aggregate via the average of the embeddings for title, then for abstract, then for body, and then we aggregate those to form a unique vector representing the paper. This works under the assumption that those three portions of the paper carry the same amount of information. Now, if we look at the right, we use trans EKGE via link prediction to train the graph and train the representation of the nodes and edges to accurately describe that a head node plus an entity is equal to the tail node whenever that appears in the graph, and broke that quality when it doesn't, basically. And we use the score in the bottom. Then we concatenate those individual representations of a paper and rank them based on cosine distance. So now moving on to evaluation and analysis, because we didn't have a ground truth, we try to reject approach by looking at both the graph structure and the models through different lenses. So first, in the graph structure, we look the journal topics should be highly related to the topics more present on the papers associated to a specific journal through our graph. And we see that happens here. For example, for the vaccine paper, journal, we see that it has paper highly associated or highly related to the vaccine in immunology topic, which makes sense. Now, moving on to the next metric, we would expect that if a model is trained on a graph that doesn't have meaningful connections, and when we try to generalize that model, it's not performing well. So we train a model on part of the graph and then evaluate it on the other portion, and we see that those scores are centered on 0, as we were expecting, because if they were not, it would mean that some of those connections are just not meaningful enough for the model to make sense of them. Now, moving on, how to rank the ML on top of the graph or the papers. We first look at the topic similarity of the recommendations and see how much overlap is there, and we see that the concatenation of semantic and KGE is the best. And now we also look at the embedding subspace on a 2D space. And here, each group of colors represents one paper and its recommendations, and as expected, they are close together. But what is most important is the distance between each of those clusters of colors, because you would expect that topics that are like highly related, such as virology and vaccines, so green and purple, are closer, as it happens in semantic and KGE, while the things that are not that closely related, such as clinical treatments and genomics, are farther away. And we see that that relation is better kept by the semantic and KGE, and that's why we went for that model. Wrapping up, we would like to thank all the team that went into doing this project. So a huge shout out for them. And thank you all for being here and listening to us.